So, what is transposing and why is transposing so important? Well, before answering those two questions, let me just briefly explain how playing by ear works, and hopefully then it'll be much more obvious why being able to transpose is so essential. So, let's say I've been playing piano for quite a while, and I can play quite a few pieces. Among them may be the Blue Danube, and so on. Maybe Mozart's Sonata in C major. And maybe a Beatles tune like Obla Di Obla Da. And maybe if I've been taught to spot patterns in the pieces I'm playing and just think about the notes, I might have noticed that those three tunes start with the same three notes. So the Blue Danube is, the Mozart Sonata is, and the Beatles tune is. So I can start with those three notes and then segue into any one of those three tunes. Or and maybe I might even have noticed those three notes in other tunes, even when they're not at the beginning, say. So, in a sense, I'll have learned as a kind of musical word. I can just hear it when it crops up in other pieces. So, supposing then I was trying to work out the tune Kumbaya, which goes like this. Well, hopefully it will have hit you that Kumbaya starts with the same three notes as those other tunes. So, playing by ear is really a memory-based skill. You have a bunch of tunes where you know how they sound and you know what the notes are. So when you hear a new tune and you just know how it sounds, you can work out what the notes are by comparing it to tunes you've already learned. And the fact that playing by ear is a memory-based skill is something that's overlooked by just about every playing by ear course I've come across. Pretty well every course just gives students maybe usually pairs of notes to work out and so on, and just hopes that the more exercises the student does, the better they'll get at it. But really what the exercises should be doing is they should be giving students a repertoire of tunes to draw on and then getting them to work out new ones. So first of all, it should be input before output. And secondly, if you get students to work out actual real pieces of music, they're much more emotionally engaged in trying to work them out rather than just putting labels on pairs of notes, which is how an awful lot of playing by ear courses work. So the first thing is that playing by ear is a memory-based skill. But here's where it gets slightly complicated, because let's take the Mozart Sonata, say. Well, Mozart wrote the sonata in C, which means that it finishes on this note, and as it happens, it also starts there. But he could have written the sonata based on D flat instead. And it would have sounded almost exactly the same. If you recorded one version of the sonata starting here, and another version starting here, and then woke me up in the middle of the night, played me one of them and asked me which one it was, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Only if you play them side by side can I tell that one of them is slightly higher than the other one. So, what is it about the notes that makes the Mozart sonata sound like the piece it is? So it isn't the notes themselves, because we can change every single note and it still sounds like the same tune. So what it is, in fact, is the relationship of the notes to each other. If you're mathematically inclined, which obviously everyone at Card Academy is, you can think of it as a bit like a translation on a graph. You're keeping the shape the same, but you're just moving it somewhere physically different. And the only reason it doesn't look the same when you move it, obviously this looks very different to this, is because firstly, you obviously have white notes and black notes and they're positioned differently on the keyboard. And secondly, the white notes and black notes are patterned irregularly because you have these gaps here and here where there are no black notes. So that means that when you actually move the same shape around the piano, it looks very different depending on where you put it. But the relationship is still the same. So that is what transposing is. Think of it as a translation on a graph. It's when you keep the shape of something the same and just move it to a different starting note. So why is it that transposing is so important? Well, when I played those three tunes at the beginning, I started all of them in the same place. I started them here. But in fact, a student might have learned those tunes somewhere different. So maybe in fact they learned to play the Blue Danube here. And maybe Obla di Oblada starts here. And so on. So then if a student is trying to work out Kumbaya, which maybe they're trying to work out somewhere different altogether, how do they realize that those first three tunes are structured the same way as the last one? Well, they need to think in terms of patterns and not in terms of notes. They need to understand what the abstract pattern of a piece is, rather than simply playing it and relying on muscle memory in order to do so. So I'll go into detail about how that works in other videos, but essentially what you do is you translate each piece into numbers instead of notes. So those numbers describe the relative position of all the notes to each other. Taking the example of, let's say, the Blue Danube. If we start it on C, we're playing in the C scale, and then we go from the first note to the third note to the fifth. So that would be called just 1, 3, 5. You could say that the Blue Danube is when you use the major scale and you play the notes 1, 3, 5, 5. So what I was doing when I was playing it on a different note was I was simply taking the major scale that starts on that note and then plugging in the numbers 1, 3, and 5. And it comes out sounding the same. So you could test students on the numbers. You could just say, okay, you've learned this piece, now type in the numbers to show that you understand the abstract pattern. But first of all, that isn't very musical or interesting. But secondly, and more importantly, it's not very practical, because if a student is working out a new tune by ear, they need to be able to just put their fingers on the notes straight away. So for this reason, I would advocate that everyone transposes tunes and chord progressions a bit, because this way you're both testing that they understand the abstract pattern and that they can move it around the keyboard, but they're also getting practice and moving it around the keyboard. This, in fact, is something jazz musicians do all the time. So a jazz musician may take a shape like, and then they will practice it on every single note on the piano. And so on. So then when it comes to playing, they can just pull the shape out of a hat and play it straight away without having to think about it, because their fingers have already learned the pattern. So it's generally thought of as being a jazz practice to transpose things, but I would advocate it for students of pop music, students of classical music, as it's really fundamental to allowing people to play by ear, improvise, and compose.